Welcome to Syria Alternative Dialogues, a podcast that provides a platform for knowledge production and evidence-based dialogues about domestic and transitional political, economic, and social challenges in Syria's protracted conflict, produced by the Syrian Center for Policy Research in partnership with the Arab Studies Institute and Security in Context.
Hello everyone, I am Rabia Nasser, a researcher in the Syrian Center for Policy Research, and we are very happy to welcome Omar Dahi, who will discuss with us today the roots and dynamics of Syria's conflict economies. In this session, you are very welcome, Omar. We are very happy to have you here. Omar is a professor of economics in Hampshire College in the US, and he is also a project director of Security in Context. We will have interesting discussion today about the roots and dynamics of conflict economies in Syria, and we will start by talking about pre-social movement intifada in Syria. You are very welcome, Omar.
Thanks so much for having me, Rabia. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's great for me to be here in a personal capacity, but also to represent our partnership with the Syrian Center for Policy Research. So let me start off by talking a little bit about Security in Context. Security in Context is a research initiative and a network focusing on peace, conflict, and international affairs. The main approach of the project is to redefine the concept and practices of security, which are traditional frameworks used by states to advance what they call national security. But in fact, as we've seen in the last century or more of practices of security, these practices often lead to more insecurity for societies and for communities domestically and internationally. So the project is really an attempt to redefine the approaches to security from a global south and transnational perspective. And a lot of our work really focuses on developing partnerships and joint research agendas with institutions, organizations, as well as individuals who are advancing their own projects on social justice, on human development, on equity, and what we broadly call desecuritization, which is to really rethink alternatives and advance alternatives to securitization and militarism. And so in that capacity, it's really a pleasure for us to be partnering with the Syrian Center for Policy Research, which is really one of the founding network members of the Security in Context network, and deepen our partnership through this podcast.
Thank you. Within this securitization framework and the amazing accumulation of the work that you contributed to in the Global South and in Syria in particular, how you can describe for us the linkages between the main challenges that face the region in terms of political oppression, militarization, and neoliberal policies? How do you see the linkages between those three factors in Syria context and in the region?
Thanks so much. Well, that's a very important question, and I think as relevant as ever. Basically, my approach is to understand what is neoliberalism and how we can connect neoliberalism to securitization, militarism, and the broader context of the conflict in Syria and the region. Of course, neoliberalism is a wide-ranging concept, and there's been a lot written, so I'm not mentioning anything new, but I'm borrowing from a lot of the work that has approach this topic from a critical perspective to examine the Middle East. To me, there are three main dimensions of neoliberalism to analyze in this context. The first is neoliberalism as a set of economic and political policies that have been directed at retrenching the state, moving away from redistributive welfare policies towards free market policies, towards entrenchment and increase of inequalities, towards the capture of wealth by corporate interests and increasing extraction of wealth from the global south in general. So there's these economic policies which really were advanced in the late 70s and 80s by Western countries, by the United States in particular, as well as an ideological component that justifies these policies and that essentially argues that the market has the solutions, that we need to increase competition, that we need to basically attack corruption, which is only by the state, by removing the state, by removing protections for labor, and so on. So there's the economic policies and there's the ideological component, and both of those have led to what I call the sort of new phase in the global economy, which is the neoliberal phase of the global economy, which entrenches these policies and justifies them. And we've seen a shift globally. The spectrum of debate has shifted from the previous era, which we can call a more developmentalist era, which was the post-World War II era, where policies now in the West, for example, that are considered left wing. For example, in the United States, you have Bernie Sanders, who is considered more on the far left in the US. Bernie Sanders' policies were very mainstream in the 1950s and 60s in the US. So the spectrum of debate in the West in general, but also globally, has shifted towards attacking the role of the state. And of course, this attack is selective. The aspects of the role of the state that are attacked are usually the ones that are redistributive, that are more investments in human development, but the state still fulfills a role in supporting big corporations, supporting militarism, supporting incarceration and surveillance and securitization of societies. So that's the first component. The second component is that the language of the market, the language of neoclassical economics, has seeped into all dimensions of society. So the logic of profit and commodification goes from simply the realm of economics and economic growth to education, to healthcare. Things that are considered human rights or public goods in sort of the previous traditions of arguing for collective rights are now considered fair game for profit, and they need to be privatized. They need to be subject to efficiency and so on. And that is also reflected in policies, of course, which privatize those dimensions or make them based on fees or withdraw straight subsidies to them. And third is the element that you started off with, which is the securitization and militarism, which both coincides with this as well as response to the fallout. The increase in neoliberalism, the entrenchment of neoliberal policies has led to social dislocation, marginalization, the redundancy of large sectors of people who were thrown off their land because it was privatized or who were released from state-owned enterprises or state enterprises, and increasing inequality and poverty, all social problems that are then not solved by social dialogue or social policy, but by securitization. So securitization as a means of responding to the negative implications of neoliberalism.
How you can explain that the Western democratic countries propose the neoliberal policies and push this agenda to be implemented in MENA regions and other countries, and at the same time, the oppressors in our region welcome the neoliberal policies and they see it as a main component of their power structure, and they increase their oppression systems and we'll say poor governance using the same policies that are proposed by democratic countries and with mainly from the Western countries as well.
Well, that's one of the main contradictions and paradoxes, that the neoliberal project was sold and promoted as a utopia, as a realm that increases freedom, that unshackles supposedly the individual from the constraints of the state. And there are those, perhaps well-intentioned advocates, who maybe thought that neoliberal policies will actually lead to democratization. Maybe they don't fully believe the market propaganda, but they believe it, or they believe that it might reduce the role of the state in societies like many Middle Eastern societies that were suffering from highly repressive states. In fact, what we've seen is the opposite. We've seen that increased neoliberalism, increased neoliberal policies has been quite compatible with increased authoritarianism. And in fact, it goes hand in hand with the state removing and withdrawing its responsibility from human development, from social protection, from redistributive policies, and saying, this is what the markets, this is what the international institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, or this is what, quote unquote, proper economics tells us to do. So they remove that aspect of the state's role. And at the same time, coinciding with these neoliberal policies, they take up the other aspect of it, which is the negative aspect of securitization, of militarism, and basically increase. And this has been in particular through the discourse of the war on terror, for example, which was also initiated by the US in 2000, coinciding with this era, which is in the name of fighting terrorism or in the name of fighting disruptive elements, extremist non-state actors, increasing repression, increasing surveillance, increasing essentially the securitization of society. So we've seen how it was quite compatible rather than pushing against this authoritarian politics.
The securitization, expanded substantially after the invasion of Iraq. And we have a lot of investment, let's say, in this kind of conflict-centered regimes and more authoritarian in the region, starting from Iraq invasion, of course, before that as well. But we have a lot of concentration of these kind of poor governance, oppression, and at the same time, like in Syria, the political power choose to have neoliberal policies, choose to make this reform without any kind of pressure from the IMF or World Bank. They don't have to take loans at that time, and they start to implement it. How this neoliberal policies and the new securitization approach changed the power structure in Syria before 2011?
That's a great question, because that links these different elements in a way that allows us to sort of focus on the Syrian conflict more specifically, because as you correctly said, Syria, unlike other global South countries, was not a major borrower from the World Bank and the IMF. So we could not say in the Syrian case that they were subject to structural adjustment policies on the condition of loan repayment. Most of the policies that were taken, you could say, voluntarily, in a sense. And in fact, one of the biggest reasons put forward by the Syrian government historically of their autarky, let's say, which is economic isolation or economic self-sufficiency, but broadly, is that we do not want to be subject to the dictates of Western countries. But in fact, that's been selective. The question is not autarky for the sake of sovereignty, but for the sake of making decisions that reproduce the political elite. And what we saw in Syria, and this predates the 2000s, of course, this goes back perhaps even to the 80s, which is a gradual rise of an economic elite that increasingly captured power, or increasingly what we can say the intermarriage or intersection of the holders of power and the holders of economic wealth, which emanated from a government or a regime that emanated from, let's say, left-wing or nationalist social movements. They abandoned that aspect of their political slogans or their political ideology and increasingly became catering to this entrenched elite inside Syria of businessmen, as our colleague Bassam Haddad says, networks of privilege inside the country that abandoned the working classes, abandoned the agricultural sector, and increased inequalities of all sorts, regional inequalities within Syria between the eastern regions of the country, though they were the producers of oil and natural gas and also the breadbaskets of Syria in various ways. They were some of the poorest regions within the country. And so this elite saw its own interests in adopting these policies. So the fact that you had lack of liberalization, lack of any ability of a societal response, independent labor unions, which were completely co-opted, independent syndicates, professional associations that could have been a countervailing power, were all destroyed and silenced. And instead, you have the voices of this entrenched elites who are quite comfortable with these policies and in fact adopted them willingly without the need to justify them or argue and worry about a long-term development project.
Why the mainstream approach, which assessed the situation in Syria in the 90s and 2000s, before the uprising, they didn't capture this kind of huge loss of increasing inequalities, marginalization of majority of the society? Why do you think this approach lack the inclusion of all the aspects of this kind of transformation toward securitization, toward neoliberal policies?
Well, it wasn't just in Syria. It was actually throughout the region. There's a very good paper by economist Karen Pfeiffer who talks about, this was before the uprisings, long before the uprisings, that she labels how Egypt, Libya, and Tunisia became IMF success stories, talking about how the IMF highly rated the reforms, quote unquote, in those countries, which were reforms that were very neoliberal. And they measured them by high growth rates, by macroeconomic stability, deregulation, the standard toolbox, so to speak, that the World Bank and the IMF had. To some extent, the World Bank rhetorically has shifted, and to some extent, the IMF. And this is perhaps a longer discussion that we can visit another time. But in practice, in fact, it continues in a variety of ways. So they were high reformers. They were given high marks that they were on the right track. And in fact, I think a deeper cause is that really there is a lack of belief in the agency of the societies themselves. So ever since the very famous 1994 Arab Human Development Report, which basically, if people knew about it or read about it, this was a very famous, or we should say infamous report that basically said that Arab societies are performing negatively in every single way. At the same time, you have that paradox that we can diagnose this problem, but at the same time, basically give legitimacy to authoritarian regimes that are a big part of the problem. So who's going to solve this issue? The lack of belief that there is agency in societies, in civil society, will lead you to then follow the path of minimal resistance that marks and rates these countries highly on growth rates, on macroeconomic stabilization, rather than looking at inequalities, rather than looking at marginalization.
And I think this is repeated with even the UN agencies. It's not just with the IFIs. The UN agencies, through the MDGs, for instance, rated Syria, Egypt, Tunisia as high performer. The Doing Business reports rated Saudi Arabia, Egypt as high performer before the Arab Spring. So there is a kind of ignoring this kind of structural problem that related to the elite and the exclusion of most of the society. And there is another narrative which we can discuss, the narrative that the culture of this region accept the oppression, which is the famous one that the social contract in the region is the key to understand that in this region we have a high development in terms of education and health and low poverty at that time, while the people accept that they are excluded from political process.
There was a brief moment, actually, after the uprising started, 2010, 2011, where all international organizations suddenly were alerted to the fact that there are social movements who reject this so-called bargain, that in fact it was never accepted, that every single country in the region had prisons full of political prisoners, had people who were disappeared, tens of thousands of people. Where are these in history? Where are these in the story of the social contract of accepting it? The fact that this was not accepted was evidenced by this explosion, this outbreak of social movements throughout the region. And for a brief moment, they shifted. And there were several reports that I would say are quite good, surprising by international organizations, including United Nations organizations, that accepted this agency. There was a brief moment in time that has now reverted. We've gone backwards instead of forwards, where now we forget about policies, we forget about social participation, we forget about societal priorities, and in fact go back to how can we compromise with these states, the de facto powers, how can we come to terms with the fact that there's authoritarian re-entrenchment in the region.
Stabilization slogan.
There you go.
I think we are trying to see how this framework that you suggested give us more perspective to understand these real dynamics that happened, to have a real understanding of the roots of the social movement and then of the conflict in the region. In this regard, how do you see your research paper about the conflict economies explain this framework, bring those factors and those roots to understand the shift from the quote-unquote stabilization toward the explosion that we see in terms of the huge social movement across the Arab regions exploded in 2011.
I'm very glad that we're talking about this question, because I think what we tried to do in the paper, which really, I should mention this was in cooperation and in development with the Syrian Center for Policy Research, and in fact followed a methodology that was advanced by the Syrian Center for Policy Research that was quite participatory in nature. We had a series of dialogue sessions, and I can talk a little bit more about that as well. But really, the idea was to present the full picture. How can we present a full picture of the conflict economies in the region and in Syria, rather than go with and accept the narratives that are often put forward by different parties in the conflict that prefer to focus on a partial aspect of this. So I think an important part of that is to discuss on the regional situation before the conflict, which we talked about some of that, which is the neoliberalism and the neoliberal policies and their consequences. But of course, there's other aspects of this. There's the legacy of external intervention into the region, which militarized the region, which solidified and entrenched the idea that might makes right, that the way to solve problems is through invasions, like the invasion of Iraq. There's, of course, the long-standing Israeli occupation and dispossession of Palestine, which goes without saying as a crucial factor of injustice in the region and hypocrisy of all the Western support for Israel that routinely and daily violates human rights, that dispossesses, that ignores international law.
And encourage the militarization of the regimes in the region.
And encourage the militarization of the regimes, which either for justified or as sloganeering or as a method of political rule, justified increased investment in militarism as opposed to human development. So you have that cycle that you can't understand the region without it. This hothouse of militarism that was dramatically accelerated by the US invasion of Iraq, which, given all the discussions now about the so-called revisionism of the rising powers of China and Russia, to me, it's important to stress that the leading revisionist powers were, in fact, the powers that supposedly created the international system. They're the ones who violated, the US having created or led this international system what's called liberal internationalism, it undermined it through illegal invasions, through illegal destruction, through basically ignoring any aspect of human rights and national sovereignty and so on, which Russia is also doing in Ukraine, but it's not the first to do it, right? China also, in its policies, is taking advantage of the World Trade Organization, which it did not create. The World Trade Organization was created as a bargain between the European Union and the United States and some developing countries. China is benefiting from its entry, and in many ways, its policies have a very ambiguous and perhaps negative impact in some cases, which, again, this is another broader discussion.
So they are competing in the rules of the game that have been created by the US.
Exactly, by the US. And so that legacy of militarization of the region, coupled with changes that have happened that are specific in the last 20 years, which is the new Cold War, so to speak, between Iran on the one hand and Saudi Arabia on the Gulf states, which was another axis of divisions and conflict within the region, all created an environment that was fertile with conflict possibilities. And the Syrian conflict in particular, though it started off as a social movement, which we'll talk about, that was demanding dignity, was demanding freedoms, political and civil liberties, that was trying to create a possibility for alternatives, met at the axis of this highly militarized, highly securitized environment. And this is what we tried to capture in the paper. And then from that, we go on to look at the dynamics of the conflict economies, how that brief moment where there was a possibilities of social movements then were closed by state actions.
Do you think that we are repeating now the same policies that have been led to the social movement? Because I think in the next discussion with you, we'll go through the dynamics of the conflict. But at least from the policies that created these kind of potential and possibilities of conflict, do you think what is going on in the implementation of policies in the countries like Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, Iraq, and of course in Syria is investing in the same roots of the conflict? Or do you think it's a different perspective now?
In my personal opinion, as someone who is not a researcher of Tunisia, I'm not someone who's an expert, but I think there's a perfect example of whatever you call it, democratic backsliding or retrenchment, is due to the fact that liberal democratic procedures did not lead to a real social alternative, social, economic, human development that can create a critical mass of support for the democratic project. You had similar IMF-induced austerity measures in the case of Tunisia. I think you had, for a variety of reasons, the readoption of the same policies, and therefore the incredible gains which made Tunisia stand out as one of the success stories or the hopeful signs that at least Tunisia was heading towards more meaningful democratic transition, saw a retrenchment. And in my opinion, I don't want to be an economic determinist, so to speak, and say it's only the economy, but when there's no social justice component, where the working classes can see a significant difference in their daily life, where the Tunisian peasant cannot see a significant improvement in their standard of living, you will not be able to create the critical mass that will support this transition, that will find alternatives in a strong man, that will basically hear every day about stories of corruption and see that as a perfect example of, quote unquote, the bankruptcy of this economic transition.
The severe inequalities increased as well. So it's not even the reward or incentives for the working class. It's the gap between the people increased, at least in the areas of what, quote unquote, they called economic reform.
And this is why the lessons aren't being learned. And we've discussed this before in various instances. And I know the center has done a lot of work on this. And I think this is something that we need to raise with international institutions, multinational institutions who are, I think, reverting to type, so to speak, reverting to a lot of the traditional policies. Yes, there is a rhetorical shift that now we care about equity and human development and so on. But I think in reality, the fact that despite this decade of conflict, there isn't a significant attention to an investment in an alternative economic model, alternative economic approach, learning the lessons of the failure of the neoliberal model is a problem. And I think this is a broader global problem. Of course, I have my idea that there's confusion now globally about what model do we follow? Is it the neoliberal Western model? Is it the Chinese development with Chinese characteristics, so to speak? I think this is a moment precisely where there is a role, for example, for civil society, and I mean civil society in its broadest form, which includes unions, which includes left-wing movements, social movements, to be leaders in this alternative. And I think the best example of that is in Latin America, where you do see a long tradition in history of social movements who had the capacity to organize, who are presenting alternatives and are actually winning power. Best example was in Chile, where the president now was just 10 years ago the leader of the student movement. He's 37 years old, I believe. He was the product of a social movement that was able to educate around education at that time. It was demanding questions in education, and they moved to talk about all of the economy.
Do you think the social movement in the region, and particularly in Syria, didn't give an answer for alternatives?
I think so. I think if we tell an honest story about the failures of the past decade, I think one of the biggest failures, this is not just in Syria. Again, I don't want to lay the blame entirely. And there's this question, I say, in the social sciences of structure versus agency, right? I think structures played a big role, global structures, regional structures, and also the global lack of alternatives, global confusion about development. But also, there wasn't any attention to it. And there are many reasons for that, which we can discuss, of course. But I think, just to put it simply, I did not see, of all the various initiatives and forums and organizations that were created that really attempted to link the political repression, which is, of course, a crucial aspect of this, but also with economic justice issues. At best, there was lip service, but in reality, it was completely devoid. Economic justice was simply not on the program of the wide majority of the political opposition in Syria.
If you read it from regional perspective, how do you think the cooperation versus what we see it now as a competition, as violence-centered relation in the region, how we can invest in the cooperation to avoid or to counter the roots of the conflict that you can see or the degradation that we see in the current phase?
I think the regional question is an interesting one, because the regional question is crucial for finding out and thinking about the ways that Syria conflict evolved. I think the regional factor was a decisive factor in a negative way, to put it this way, which is the investment of regional states in agitating for a militarized solution to the conflict.
Identity politics.
Identity politics. So the initial response to the social movement by the Syrian state, and we can discuss this more perhaps later on, was dehumanization of the social movement, a militarized, securitized response, arrests, suppression, and an invitation for reform, but one that was completely dictated top down, that had to accept basically whatever the state said, rather than actually recognizing the other, recognizing that there is perhaps another social power that they had to discuss and acknowledge that is independent from themselves, right? But again, I know we're going to talk later at some point in more detail about this particular period, but the broader response was, rather than a regional investment in social, political, cultural alternatives, which is what the social movement ideally would have done in Syria, there was attention to the political, securitized direction. And that is part of the catastrophe that we have in Syria, a big part of the catastrophe. Now, I think we're at a point where these alternatives then became problems for the countries that invested in them themselves. And I think part of what I think civil society or other organizations have to show is, how can we actually provide policies that rethink this approach, but ones that could also be not zero-sum, could be beneficial on a regional scale as well. And I think this is an important part of where the thinking could be at this point.
This is very interesting and informative discussion, Omar. Thank you very much. And we will continue the discussion about the dynamics of conflict in the next one. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You are listening to Syria Alternative Dialogues, a collaborative podcast by the Syrian Center for Policy Research in partnership with the Arab Studies Institute and Security in Context.